Back on the SportsMax Zone, Who Only Cricket Know is a book by English author David Woodhouse that gives a comprehensive account of England's tour of the West Indies in 1954. Woodhouse ranks that series behind the Bodyline Ashes series back in 1933 as England's most controversial in their cricketing history. That 1954 series, which introduced Sir Garfield Sobers to the world, was dominated by issues of racism and classism. Riots were also sparked by fans at the matches. Out of that series, Wisden recommended that the West Indies move away from appointing domestic umpires. They proposed the creation of a panel of umpires from across the region to stand in international matches. Wisden also voiced their displeasure at the Windies' use of a player-manager. Woodhouse's work was voted by Wisden as Cricket Book of the Year 2021. He joins us now on the SportsMax Zone. Mr. Woodhouse, great to have you on the SportsMax Zone here. Cricket is a topic that we discuss with a lot of emotion and vigor on this show. Let me start here. What triggered your desire to pen this book?
Well, thank you for having me on. To be honest, my interest started because of my interest in the England captain, Len Hutton, who was the first professional captain of England. So his story has a lot of parallels with Frank Worrell's journey to become the first black captain with tenure in the West Indies. But I quickly became fascinated by the series. As you say, it's often compared to Bodyline, and it has all of the elements of Bodyline. It has intimidatory bowling. George Headley, you know, the great Jamaican hero, was put in hospital by Fred Truman in a warm-up game. It had a diplomatic incident, several of them. Alexander Bustamante was snubbed by Hutton allegedly in the Sabina Park Pavilion, and that caused a big incident. And there was also a court-martial back at Lord's after the tour where Fred Truman had his good conduct bonus docked and Trevor Bailey was sacked as vice-captain. So I just got tremendously interested in all the incidents that happened in the series. And as you say, it's at a time where the West Indian Islands are moving towards independence. So on the one side, nationalist people want to see the West Indies win very badly. As you say, Sobers made his debut. We have the three W's in full effect. We have Ramadan and Valentine. So it was really a remarkable series, even before some of the political incidents that, and as you said, umpiring decisions that marred the series.
Yeah, well, the series ended 2-2, and as you've pointed out, it was a point at which the West Indies began to stake its claim as one of the best test teams in the world with the three W's. And as you said, Sir Garfield, who I think only played in the fifth test, he debuted in the very last.
In this series, George Headley played his last test.
Yes.
In the first test match, he was brought back by public subscription in Jamaica. So he actually got paid 4 times more than the other players because of the big collection by the local population. And as you say, Sobers played in the last game. And West Indies were 2-0 up, actually. I mean, they appeared to be cruising to a win. The series was billed as the World Championship of Cricket because, as you'll remember, West Indies had beaten England very easily in 1950 in England, and England had just beaten Australia in the Coronation Ashes. And so early in the series, Ramadan and Valentine still cast their spell over England, and it looked as if West Indies would win easily. But then England regrouped under Len Hutton's captaincy. He scored 2 very big centuries, and they managed to get back. The last test was played at Sabina Park, as the first one was, and they managed to get it back to 2-2. But the cricket wasn't the whole story. In British Guyana, as it was then, where there was a state of emergency, Cheddi Jagan had just been put under house arrest. There was a riot during the third test match, the first riot in modern times. Before the fourth test in Trinidad, the main stand at the Queen's Park Oval was burned down. And there were some incidents in Jamaica as well. In the first test, Jeffrey Stolmeyer, in those days, of course, I'm afraid, it was still the unwritten rule that a white man had to be captain. He was booed remorselessly in the first test by the Jamaican crowd for not enforcing the follow-on. So there were incidents aplenty.
Yeah. Because the issue and the level of controversy that is surrounding this series, I think that by itself would draw a lot of people to read this book because, to be quite honest, I don't think the level of controversy that existed in that test series is much highlighted. So I think people looking on and seeing the general gist of the novel their interest would be piqued because it's almost something that has, I don't want to say went unnoticed, but certainly the level of controversy in this series hasn't been something talked about that much. You mentioned, racism, classism, and the umpiring issues and so on. What aspect of your book you think would cause the most discussion from a controversial standpoint?
Well, I think, as you say, it's interesting that the series isn't really that well remembered. I think in the West Indies it's partly because, they blew a 2-0 lead. I think it's also because at that particular time, island rivalry was perhaps even more fierce than it is now. There were lots of arguments between the islands, between Trinidad and Jamaica, between Barbados and Trinidad. And maybe in the West Indies, people don't want to remember it quite in the way they do remember Frank Worrell as a triumphant captain in the 1960s, and he had to wait till the end of the decade. And on the English side, I suppose they're slightly embarrassed by the fact that the players didn't behave very well and showed dissent to the umpires and so forth. But I think the sort of big issue or the sort of framing of that series is that there were still a lot of people in the West Indies, white settlers and British civil servants, who really wanted to see MCC, as it was then, beat the West Indies, to keep, as it were, the natives in their place. So the English team got caught in this vortex of, on the one hand, not being particularly popular with the nationalist people because they were not really behaving as they were expected to, and on the other hand, getting into trouble with the sort of, in inverted commas, local white population, but not sort of keeping good form, as it were. So I think that particular moment in history means it's an interesting thing for people to think about. And of course, some of the issues, I'm afraid, sadly, are still relevant today. There was an incident where 2 Yorkshire players, Fred Truman and Johnny Wardle, allegedly racially abused an umpire in Guyana. So some of those issues, sadly, are still with us today.
Yeah, when you wrote this book, did you feel as if, the reception would be how it is? Because it was actually given a lot of awards, one being the Wisden Cricket Book of the Year.
To be honest with you, it took me so long to write the book that it became more relevant than possibly it might have been. While I was writing the book, obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement started, and there were these issues in England. So I think the book probably has a little bit more relevance than I expected it to. But while many things have changed for the better, and one of the journeys in the book is Worrell's journey to be captain. He had to wait for a long time to become captain after Jeff Stolmar. There were 3 more captains before him. There's also the journey of Len Hutton as a working-class person becoming the captain of England when normally that was an amateur. So those journeys, I think, still have some relevance. And if you think about the book Michael Holding wrote, which has won more awards than mine, rightly so. Leary Constantine wrote a book in 1954 called Colour Bar, that in many of its details is saying almost exactly the same things as Michael is saying today. So while things have moved on for the better in many ways, I think some of these issues of injustice, even though sport, of course, is such a force for good in many ways, it does sometimes bring to the surface some of these prejudices.
David, as a high schooler, I read a lot of the things I read about Caribbean culture and history and Caribbean literature made mention of the immortal phrase, what do they know of cricket, who only cricket know? Of course, C.L.R. James. And I spent my university years hunting the book that everybody was referring to on this immortal phrase. Finally found it a very, like a third-hand copy. I got almost for free from the bookstore. It was the last one, and it holds pride of place on my mantelpiece. I say all that to ask the inspiration to use a part of that immortal line for the title of this book.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you picked that up, yes. I mean, what I didn't realise, actually, till I reread Beyond the Boundary, was that that phrase is used in the chapter about England's tours of the West Indies in the post-war period. And as you'll remember, there was a riot in 1953-54 on the tour I've written about. There was then a riot in Trinidad on the next MCC visit, and then there was a riot at Sabina Park at the end of the 1960s. And C.L.R. James uses that phrase for the first time in his discussion of those riots. And also, as you may know, the line actually leads to a line of Rudyard Kipling, what do they know of England, who are only England,
Yes.
quite deliberately sort of bowling a googly. And one thing I do suggest is that a year before Beyond the Boundary was written, an English politician made a speech on St George's Day quoting that line and saying, "We the English know more of England than anybody else," sort of renouncing the idea of a Commonwealth. And that politician happened to be Enoch Powell. So I do wonder whether C.L.R. James, when he coined that famous phrase, did have Powell in mind and was trying to show that, the connections between the Caribbean and Britain, and of course some of them are pernicious connections, but that cricket has generally been a force for good.
Yeah, and you speak of parallels, and in reading Beyond the Boundary, I got the impression from it that C.L.R. James wanted you at any moment in time that you read the book to project from what was written into the book and make a comparison about the present that you were in. So I ask the same question. In preparing this, in preparing the manuscript, in preparing this book, do you intend to take the reader on a journey of comparison and parallel drawings, or is it that they're to just enjoy the moments as captured in the book, chronicling the times of which you wrote?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there are two separate things. And the cricket itself was very exciting, full of tremendous players. On the English side, we have people like Dennis Compton. So I did want to convey how exciting the cricket was, with England coming back from 2-0 down. But you're right that I think that the wider messages of the book, I hope, still have some relevance in terms of cricket, that sort of double consciousness about cricket that I think must exist in the Caribbean, in the sense that it's been such a source of pride to Caribbean people, and of course best team in the world for 20 years. When I was growing up, the West Indies were dominant, and people like Richards and Holding were heroes to me. But at the same time, it is in some ways a stuffy English game, isn't it? I mean, C.L.R. James talks about that in Beyond the Boundary a lot. And so I suppose, how will cricket move forward now? I mean, there are issues in England where there are more public school boys in the England team today than there were in 1954. But also that sort of question of how the traditions of cricket will carry on in the Caribbean. For example, I personally think it's an act of cultural vandalism that the venues which held the Test matches in 1954, apart from Bridgetown, none of them host Test matches against England anymore. That seems to me, for all the other reasons that might be involved, tourism and raising money for the local game, it's surely wrong that people in Guyana, Trinidad and Jamaica never get to see an England team in a Test match anymore.
Yeah, finally, David, in reviewing a lot of material to write this book, is there any one fact you discovered in preparing to write this book and writing this book that even though is perhaps the most startling, something that you discovered that you hadn't known before and hadn't been led into the direction of discovering before?
Well, I hope there are a few facts in the book. I suppose one little fact that I did find interesting was Len Hutton had a massive disagreement with a Trinidad player called Ellis Chong, who was one of the umpires. So it caused a tremendous sort of incident in the fourth test, and Tom Graveney threw the ball down in disgust. And what I did manage to find out was that in the Bradford League in 1944, Ellis Chong had deliberately bowled 4 byes to stop Hutton getting a collection for his 50. So suddenly the sort of incident in that test match, which caused tremendous controversy, you could suddenly understand why the two men had a bit of tension. So I hope there's a few little stories like that in the book where cricketers coming up against each other in maybe state matches or in county matches feeds into the test matches that I write about.
Mm-hmm. David Woodhouse, great talking to you here on the SportsMax Zone. Congratulations again on the Wisden Honour for Who Only Cricket Know, and the readers, I'm sure, will be fully engrossed in the content of this book, and it's great because cricket still retains, especially in the older generation, David, retains its prominence among sports discussions here in the Caribbean, albeit declining. But we hope that your presentation will help to resuscitate some of that glory of international cricket.
It's very kind of you to have me on, and I hope some of your viewers will enjoy the book.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, David Woodhouse there. author of the book Who Only Cricket Know, Wisden's Book of the Year 2021. We have more to come on the SportsMax Zone after this.
Thank you for watching SportsMax on YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay informed.